What if I told you that a country sitting on more oil than Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United States combined, a country that once boasted the highest living standards in Latin America, collapsed so catastrophically that 7 million people fled, making it the worst economic crisis in modern peacetime history? This isn't a war story. This is Venezuela. And here's what nobody tells you. While Venezuela was bleeding out economically, two superpowers, the United States and China, were locked in a silent, brutal competition for control of its oil wealth. One wanted to spread democracy and contain rivals. The other wanted energy security and geopolitical leverage. Both failed spectacularly. Let me show you what really happened, because this story reveals everything about how great powers compete for resources in the 21st century, and how even the world's largest economies can miscalculate when ideology and economics collide. When I study global economic competition, Venezuela stands out as perhaps the most dramatic case study of resource wealth meeting geopolitical rivalry. The numbers alone are staggering. Venezuela holds 298.3 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, 17.5% of the world's total. To put this in perspective, that's more than Saudi Arabia's 266 billion barrels. It's an oil paradise sitting just 500 miles from the United States. So how did paradise become hell? In 1999, Hugo Chavez came to power promising to end inequality and corruption. He had a point. At the time, the wealthiest fifth of Venezuelans controlled 54% of national income, while the poorest fifth had just 3%. Oil prices were soaring in the early 2000s, reaching over $100 per barrel, and Venezuela was swimming in cash. Chavez nationalized the oil industry, fired 30,000 experienced engineers and technicians from the state oil company PDVSA, and replaced them with political allies. This is where the story gets interesting for China. In 2007, Venezuela became the testing ground for China's revolutionary oil for loan strategy. The China Development Bank began extending massive loans to Venezuela, eventually totaling over $67 billion, which represents more than 40% of all Chinese investment in Latin America. Let me repeat that. Venezuela alone received more Chinese loans than the entire continent of Africa. Here's how it worked. China would lend billions of dollars to Venezuela, and Venezuela would repay not in cash, but in oil shipments, typically 100,000 to 400,000 barrels per day, depending on oil prices. When oil was $50 per barrel, Venezuela could repay with 400,000 barrels daily. When prices fell in 2016, they'd need to ship 800,000 barrels to cover the same debt service. But they couldn't. Oil production collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1999 to just 850,000 barrels by 2023. The technical expertise was gone, investment had dried up, the machinery was falling apart. Venezuela couldn't even produce enough oil to repay its Chinese loans, let alone fund its own economy. By 2018, Venezuela had entered hyperinflation so extreme that it exceeded 130,000% annually, making it more severe than Zimbabwe's 2008 crisis. The economy contracted by 74% between 2013 and 2023. To give you a sense of the devastation, this is comparable to the economic collapse in Iraq during war or the Soviet Union's dissolution. But Venezuela achieved this in peacetime under a single government. Now let's talk about what the United States wanted, and here's where the story gets complicated. On paper, American interests in Venezuela were straightforward: restore democracy, stop drug trafficking, and prevent Chinese and Russian influence from spreading in America's backyard. The United States imposed wave after wave of sanctions starting in 2015, targeting Venezuelan officials, then expanding to freeze PDVSA assets in 2019 and prohibit most U.S. companies from doing business with Venezuela's oil sector. But here's the contradiction. Even as the U.S. condemned Maduro's regime, American oil company Chevron continued operating in Venezuela, managing about 25% of the country's oil production. Why? Because Washington faced an impossible choice: cut off all oil operations, and China would dominate Venezuela's energy sector entirely. Allow Chevron to stay, and critics accused the U.S. of propping up a dictatorship. The sanctions hit hard. Venezuela's oil production fell from 1.5 million barrels per day before primary sanctions to just 337,000 barrels by June 2020 after secondary sanctions, a 78% collapse. But did sanctions achieve their goal of regime change? No. Maduro stayed in power, supported by Cuba, Russia, and China. And this brings us to the deeper question: what did China really want from Venezuela? From Beijing's perspective, Venezuela represented three critical strategic objectives. First, energy security. China is the world's largest oil importer, and diversifying supply away from the Middle East has always been a priority. Venezuela's extra heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, where China invested billions through joint ventures, promised long-term supply security. In 2010, China's national oil company signed a 25-year land grant for 40% ownership in one portion of the Orinoco Belt. Second, geopolitical influence. Venezuela became China's gateway to Latin America, a region historically dominated by the United States. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, Venezuela signed infrastructure deals worth billions: railways, satellites, telecommunications, housing projects, all funded by Chinese loans and built by Chinese companies using Chinese equipment. Third, testing the oil for loan model. If China could make this work in Venezuela, securing both oil supply and political influence through financial leverage, it could replicate the model across resource-rich developing nations in Africa, Central Asia, and beyond. But there was a fundamental problem. The oil for loan deals assumed Venezuela would increase production. Instead, production collapsed. By 2016, China stopped extending new loans. Venezuela still owes China approximately $20 billion in crude-linked debt and can't fully repay it. Now, let me show you the real tragedy of this story, because it's not just about great power competition, it's about human suffering. By 2021, 95% of Venezuela's population was living in poverty based on income, with 77% in extreme poverty. A teacher's monthly salary could buy a dozen eggs and 2 pounds of cheese. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. Electricity blackouts became routine. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans, more than 20% of the population, fled the country, mostly on foot, to Colombia, Peru, Chile, and the United States. The United States blamed China for propping up Maduro's regime. China blamed U.S. sanctions for strangling the economy. Both were partially right and both miscalculated badly. The U.S. assumed sanctions would force regime change. They didn't. Maduro adapted by allowing cryptocurrency transactions, forming a shadow fleet of tankers to evade sanctions, and accepting economic reforms that partially stabilized inflation by 2023, but at the cost of extreme inequality. Venezuela now has the highest inequality in the Americas. China assumed that huge financial leverage would secure oil supply and political loyalty. Instead, they're stuck with $20 billion in unpaid debt, oil shipments far below promised levels, and a partner too weak to be strategically useful. As one Chinese official told me privately, we learned an expensive lesson about political risk assessment. Here's what this tells us about 21st century geopolitics. First, resource wealth without good governance is a curse, not a blessing. Venezuela proved that having the world's largest oil reserves means nothing if you can't extract it efficiently, manage it transparently, or invest in long-term development. Second, great power competition in resource-rich countries creates perverse incentives. The U.S. wanted democracy, but its sanctions harmed ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. China wanted oil, but its loans enabled corruption and mismanagement. Neither power achieved its goals because both treated Venezuela as a chessboard rather than a country with real people. Third, the old models don't work anymore. America's sanctions and democracy playbook failed to oust Maduro. China's loans for resources playbook failed to secure a reliable supply. Both sides learned that you can't simply buy influence or sanction your way to preferred outcomes in complex failing states. So what happens next? As of January 2026, the Trump administration has reimposed maximum pressure sanctions targeting Maduro's family, oil tankers, and shadow fleet operations. They've seized vessels, imposed 25% tariffs on countries importing Venezuelan oil, and demanded Maduro's removal. Meanwhile, China has not abandoned Venezuela entirely, but they've recalibrated. No new large-scale loans since 2016. Continued diplomatic support at the UN, yes, but the Grand Belt and Road ambitions scaled back dramatically. A smaller Chinese company, China Concord Resources Corp., signed a $1 billion investment deal in 2024 to produce 60,000 barrels daily, a fraction of earlier commitments. Both superpowers are stuck. The U.S. can't force regime change without military intervention, which nobody wants. China can't recover its loans without Venezuela stabilizing, which seems unlikely under Maduro. And Venezuela itself remains trapped between authoritarianism and chaos, with neither democracy nor prosperity in sight. This is the brutal reality of resource competition in our era. Even the world's most powerful nations can pour billions of dollars into a country, deploy sophisticated strategies, and still achieve little beyond prolonging suffering. The $67 billion question, which China asked and America tried to answer, was whether Venezuela's oil wealth could be controlled through economic leverage or political pressure. The answer turned out to be neither, and that's a lesson that echoes far beyond Caracas. From the lithium fields of Africa to the rare earth mines of Central Asia, in the 21st century, whoever masters the art of sustainable resource partnership, rather than zero-sum resource competition, will win the future. Right now, nobody's figured it out.